At some point in your C# coding experience, you're going to have to learn how to deal with error conditions. Yes, I know, shock of all shocks. Sometimes your code isn't going to work the way that you thought it would, or something is going to happen to cause a problem in your program. The way that we deal with that in C# and in .NET is through the use of exceptions. And that's what we're going to see how to use in this particular section. An exception is basically an error that happens during your program's execution, whether it's because the user put in some data value that you weren't expecting, or the system runs out of memory, or something else bad happens. So let's take a look at an example of an exception, and then we'll learn about how to handle exceptions in your code. Let's imagine I have two variables, x and y. They're both integers, and I've declared them as you see here. And then I declare another variable called result, and I divide x by y. Well, dividing 10 by 5, that's okay. The result is 2. But what happens if I set y to 0? And then I try to divide x by y, and oh, that's a problem. I'm dividing by 0. What happens here is the .NET Framework raises what's called an exception. In this case, it's a divide by 0 exception. And we'll learn about these terms a little bit later, but the point is that an exception, just generically speaking, is a problem in the code or somewhere in the system that you have to anticipate and handle. So before we go any further, let's learn about some exception terminology. Exceptions are raised, or using object-oriented nomenclature, they are thrown when an error is encountered. Now, when an exception happens, the normal flow of the program is interrupted, and the control is transferred to the nearest exception handler. You might say that the handler catches the exception. So the exception is thrown somewhere, and then it is caught somewhere else. Now, if there is no exception handler to process that exception, and the exception happens to be a fatal one, then the program just terminates with an error code. Now, not all exceptions are fatal, but some of them are. And if the exception that gets raised is fatal, then your program's going to stop working. Now, exceptions don't just come from the .NET Framework. You can build your own exceptions and then raise them yourself. In other words, you throw your own exceptions using the throw instruction, and we'll see how to do that. Let's take a look at an example of how exceptions are handled in code. Now, there's three main keywords you're going to have to learn about when you're working with exceptions. The first one is try. Code that is placed inside the try block, inside those curly braces, is a bunch of code that attempts to do something. Doesn't matter how many lines you have in there. It could be 1, could be 5, could be 25,000. It doesn't matter. The point is that inside that try block, you're going to do a whole bunch of code. You're going to assign a catch block. Now, this is actually optional, but you assign a catch block where you think an exception might happen. So if the code inside the try block might cause a problem, then you assign a catch block, and this is where exceptions are handled. So if something goes wrong inside the code that's inside the try, then the code that's inside the catch is going to happen. And then last, there's the finally keyword, and this code is always run. Doesn't matter if things were great or if things were bad. If the code in the try section completed just fine, or if there was a problem and the code in the catch section had to run, the code in the finally section is always going to run. So let's take a look at an example. Suppose we had our example from earlier. We have those two integers, one is 10, one is 0, and we have the result. Well, if we try to divide x by y, in this case, we've got 10 divided by 0, that's going to cause an exception, in which case the program flow will be transferred to the catch block. And here we're going to just write out, hey, look, an error happened. And we can do a whole bunch of things in here. In this case, we're writing out an error message, but there's other code that we could have written here to try to handle the exception. Maybe we could ask the user to try putting in a different value, or we could just try something else. The point is that the code in the catch block is going to run when the problem happens. So let's take a look at some real code to see how to write this. Okay, so I'm in my using exceptions example. And in my snippets, you see I've scrolled down to the exceptions section. So let me copy the setup code, and we'll paste it here into main. And we'll go back to the sample. We'll scroll down a little bit, and we'll take this entire piece of try, catch, and finally, and we'll paste that in as well. So what I've done here is I've defined 3 different blocks of code. One is called try, one is called catch, one is called finally. Now, if I run this code in its current state, I've got 10 being divided by 5 on line 18 right here, and that should just be fine. What should happen is the console.writeLine for the result is going to be executed, and it will show me the results. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. And you can see that the result is 2, and you can also see that a line is being written out that says, just proving that this code always runs. And if we go back to the code, you'll see that that's in the finally section down here. Remember earlier I said that the code in the finally section always gets run. Doesn't matter what happens in the try or the catch block. Okay, so now let's change the code so that we have an error happen. So let's do this. We're going to change y to 0. So now we're going to have 10 divided by 0, and that's going to cause a problem. So we're going to get to line 18. We're going to try to divide 10 by 0, and an exception is going to happen. What that means that the code at line 19, this console.writeLine statement, is never going to get run. What's going to happen is the code is going to be transferred, the program flow is going to be interrupted, and we're going to jump down here into this catch block where this line of code, an error occurred, better check the code line is going to be run. So now let's try this. And you can see that what happened was we tried to divide 10 by 0, which is a math error. And you can see that the console.writeLine inside the catch block is writing out an error occurred, better check the code. And also we can see that the code in the finally block always runs because that console.writeLine line also got executed. Okay, so that's a quick introduction on how to use exceptions. And as we move through the rest of this section, we'll learn more about how to create our own exceptions and work with exceptions in a more advanced fashion.